A very simple thing. I got on my bike. Max and I ate hot cross buns because it was Easter 2010, just after the launch of the original iPad, and that came up with 2 apps. The longer system, really, it was a question of timing. It was the fact that the iPad had just come out, and particularly this very successful content-based app, The Elements, about which you'll see more in a second. But for me, it was because I'd just been given a new small division at Faber called Faber Digital with an incredibly open brief. And Jonas and I were talking earlier, both of us had or have very, very open briefs that deliberately ignore much of the activity in our areas to allow us to get on with new things. And in my case, that was things that went beyond straight text ebooks. And as much as timing, that was a mindset. It was a mindset that meant I was free to find people doing interested things, go and pursue them, go and find them. But then when I found them, have an open mind about the business relationship that would allow us to do that. And then the slightly more pretentious way of looking at it was that this is 2 cultures coming together. Faber, best known for poetry, certainly best known for the arts and culture, coming together with an organisation, as you'll see, founded by scientists.
I think it's interesting to know a little bit about how we came about, because I think there's a lot of clues in that for how many publishers can get into app production. I expect many of you are already involved in the area. But I think one of the things you need, and I was very lucky to get it here, is a background in media production, or at least you need people in your team who know how to make television programs. This is BBC Television Centre, where I spent about 10 years making lots of films. I think my favourite film was one with Tom Baker, who used to be Doctor Who, and Douglas Adams. We made a film about the future of the internet before there was an internet, and it was Douglas's great vision. So I had a background in making scientific films especially. And I then joined a very early group in the BBC called the Interactive Television Unit. And this was in the sort of late 80s. And the BBC saw absolutely no future in anything interactive or digital, so they wanted to close us down. And we didn't want to be closed down, so we went to New York and raised some money, and we set up we did a management buyout from the BBC and set up a crazy company. As I can see at least one person in the audience who used to work there, and several of the people there now are head of design at Nokia and quite senior in Google and various places. So it was an interesting, very early incarnation of the interactive digital world we're looking at now. The company actually, during a brief period of success, went public. We floated on the London Stock Exchange and had a very interesting few years learning how to make mistakes. Those of you who saw Bob Stein's presentation this morning will have got a sense of a bit of that history. There was a lot of very early thinking about interactive publishing around about the early 90s. I then got into producing a lot of interactive installations in museums and that kind of place, and I met up with this fellow, Theodore Gray. Absolutely extraordinary fellow. He's a writer, still writes a column every month for Popular Science in America, and he's also one of the key people behind Mathematica, Wolfram Research, and most recently Wolfram Alpha, which is a very interesting computational knowledge engine that we use in a lot of our titles, and Wolfram Alpha ended up being a shareholder in Touch Press. Theo, however, was most famous for having built this. He won an Ig Nobel Prize for it. That's the Ig Nobel Prize there. It's given to him by a real Nobel Prize winner, and it's for an invention that makes you, or a piece of science, I should say, that makes you laugh and then makes you think. And in this case, it's a periodic table. And in each of these compartments is a lump of an element. And to cut a long story short, he and I both shared a passion for collecting elements from the periodic table, and we kept falling out over the same nuclear bomb component on eBay, and we decided in the end it was better to collaborate. So we decided to do that and started building periodic tables. There is a reason I'm telling you this story, because it's essentially the reason the app, The Elements, came about. We ended up producing about 50 of these installations around the world in museums and galleries, and we amassed an enormous collection of objects to do with the periodic table. And Teo said, let's photograph those. We'll do a website, good URL, periodictable.com, and I'll write a book, which he did, called The Elements, and it was published by Black Dog and Leventhal. And every object in the book is from our collection and is photographed very beautifully. And Teo, being a great visionary, insisted that we photograph each object not once, but 720 times on a turntable. So I asked him why. He said, absolutely no idea, but it might come in useful one day. And that day arrived in January of 2010, when St. Jobs came down from the mountain and announced the iPad. It's worth, I think, briefly pausing to acknowledge what an extraordinary man this was, a real loss. I found a quote the other day from his launch speech for the iPad 2. Technology alone is not enough. Maybe we could close the door at the back. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with humanities, and there's liberal arts and humanities sitting at the table opposite, that yields results that make our hearts sing. So we had 60 days after Steve Jobs announced the iPad to actually make an app that would be ready to ship when the iPad was actually available. And it was called The Elements. We've now sold 250,000 copies of it, 250,000 copies, at $14. So that seemed to us a very good reason to start a publishing business in this space, and that's what Touch Press is. There are three things that we think of when we are trying to decide what titles. One is that the title should have some kind of authorship behind it. And I think that's a distinctive thing for someone interested in developing apps. It's, of course, completely bread and butter for anyone in the publishing industry, but it is all those good things about editorial curation of authors and building authors is very important. But we also have a huge respect for the talents of software writers and software developers. Here are some of the greatest software developers we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. And it was those two things that came together when Henry and I met, I think, and that led to The Wasteland.
Thank you. So on to The Wasteland, and what I think I'm going to talk about here is the process of designing it, the process of working together, but I think particularly it's obviously written from my point of view as a traditional publisher, so I think I'm always alert to what is different to the operations of traditional publishing, for which basically read Faber, but I think some of the lessons do apply to publishers, very much do apply to publishers as a whole. The idea really isn't complicated. It's let's make an app of The Wasteland. Wasn't a great deal more than that. It's the execution and finding the right people, as we talked about. So it was everything that's come up to this point that makes that simple idea meaningful and valuable. And I think people often dwell on the ideas a lot, but I knew when I, in the Touch Press office, suddenly the sort of disjunction, the surprise of Touch Press working on a poetry app, I knew that in itself would have mileage. And of course, the truth is Touch Press aren't really just scientists. I don't think Max's initial degree was in science. But the sort of the angle was that. There's one email, I think, from Max during the early stages of the project. I think it was probably largely addressed to the chief software engineer on the project. It uses Max's characteristic use of capital letters in an email, but I also think it's about, it was the guiding principle really for the development, and it's this. It wasn't just so much having the functionality or implementing it, but it's making sure that it's done really, really well. And I think that's what we're alluding to in the sense of iteration in building the app. So, I mean, there are sort of tangible examples of iteration. At the start of the project, when we were talking about this in-house, we published an elegant, huge hardback facsimile of the manuscript edited by Eliot's widow. And at first, that was going to play an absolutely huge role in the app. A few months in, once we'd actually got to grips on it, it was going to play no role whatsoever. And then, really quite close to launch, it suddenly had a new life and a very simple way of being implemented in the app, and it's proven to be one of the most popular features of it. But I think the interesting thing there is we had to earn the right to bring it back in. We had to get the implementation right. And the same around buttons, icons and buttons, which a sharp-eyed of you will see a Eliot reference in that line there. But the buttons would appear, the debates we would have about buttons is absolutely extraordinary. And you've got the principle on one hand of trying to minimize and remove them and have a completely clean interface. On the other hand, making something usable on the basis of current understandings of the iPad and how people use it. But I think the overarching feature was that there's a really detailed, really thorough implementation in priority order. So you wouldn't get, and that's the discipline I've seen and learned and was so impressed by and was part of, was that you don't move on to the thing you're really excited about moving on to until you've got the basics right, until you've got the poem presenting right, implementing the notes, the annotations, the relationship between notes and text took a long time, and it was about the patience of that. The project was characterized by a massive attention to detail, and from everyone, from a very, very senior level, and that sort of attention to detail from a senior level, and from everyone in the project. No one was too grand to look, to test, to go through it in great detail, and that was absolutely vital. There's a rather wonderful thing, a momentum behind the project in which we assumed everything was possible, almost deliberately be naive, forget that you know that that's not the done thing, or that's not the usual approach to rights, or the usual approach to relationships. Forget that, assume it's possible, and I don't think that is a traditional publishing mindset. But if you do, as we found here, it doesn't always come off, but quite often you will actually achieve what you want to. It's also talking about clearing the debris, by which trying to take as much of the burden away so that the software engineer and the designer had free rein to get on and do their job. The project had a home in Dublin, in that the designer was based there, the software engineering based, in fact, in rural Ireland on one of the world's slowest internet connections. But having a focal point for the project and a small core team, even though the list of credits and the number of people who contributed is massive, a small core team was profoundly valuable to the project. I think another approach, the project was very fluid and opportunistic, and I mean opportunistic in a good way. It would seize opportunities that I think the very rigorous schedules applied to the traditional publishing program and the division of jobs in traditional publishing often cause us to miss out on. Consensus is good, I found, but so is disagreement. There's nothing wrong with having a good argument about things, and in fact I think sometimes a productive argument is too rare a thing. And there's nothing wrong with a U-turn. If you decide something, as with the manuscript, it wasn't the wrong decision to cut out the manuscript at first, it was the right decision at the time, and then as we realized we had time and the opportunity to implement it, we did. The final thing I'll say is that the BBC and Academy and the Arts Council are filming a really detailed masterclass. If you really want to get under the hood of this app, see not me, but the software engineer and the designer talk. Keep a lookout on the BBC Academy and Arts Council websites in a few weeks' time, and there'll be they were going to record in great detail this, and you'll really get an opportunity to see properly under the bonnet. But before I move on to allow Max to give a similar picture of our other project, the solar system, in case some of you don't quite know what I'm on about, I'm just going to give a 30-second rundown of the app itself, just to show some of the functionality to which I was referring. So I could, for example, show you the notes in which, say, for example, I want to see what... I was going to say that word, then I realized it's a German word, and I'll say it wrong, so I'll just tap it. And indeed, here, it's the very simple functionality that, of course, is far less simple to implement than it may first appear. But a long time was spent just getting this polished, and it has shown, and people have been delighted to see it. The relationship, I drew a sort of scale between getting rights to do something and implementation, because it's a balance. You need to have both. And because it came off, we, for example, could pull out Alec Guinness a recording that had been sitting unused in the BBC archives, or we could pull out this early...
Out of this stony rubbish, son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you...
Or we could pull out that forgotten recording of Eliot reading it in the 30s. Or indeed, because there sort of weren't rules to break, we could suddenly decide, well, we could make a movie, which we did in Dublin. We filmed Fiona Shaw performing this, and this broke with the tradition of us licensing her rights for 15 years, and suddenly let's exploit them direct, get to the source, get to the talent directly, which is going to be a theme when I start to talk about what next. So here's a very quick segment of Fiona's performance.
You cannot say
Yeah.
or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water.
There's never any fair time to stop that, but I'll stop it now and move on to Max, who's going to talk to you about the solar system.
Can I just ask who here is familiar with the Solar System app? Okay, probably about a third of the people here. Well, the other 2/3 obviously need to get it. I'll be equally brief then. Solar System is an interesting case study in publishing, I think, because with the elements, as I showed you, the book came first. The book was published 6 months before the app. At the time we published the app, the book had sold 70,000 copies in hardback. We were very pleased with that. But Black Dog and Leventhal were rather sniffy about us publishing an app because they thought perhaps it might cannibalize their sales. That book has now sold 400,000 copies to the app's 250,000, and a lot of that extra sale, I think, came about precisely because of the synergy between the book and the app. So, it's absolutely not a question of either or, it's a question of both. So here is Solar System. If any of you know the elements, you'll see that it is a little bit like a periodic table of planets and moons. The sun is on the left, the planets go out to the right. Let me choose a planet and we go into to see it. And this page here is a page in a book. I can turn the page using the bottom right-hand corner. It's a kind of tradition we've tried to develop that you can go from page to page. Every page should do something and be alive. The drawings, I'm swiping on it here. I don't know if you can see. As I move, I can peel open the illustrations. But this page here is a really good example of all the different rights and components that we needed to bring together in Solar System to publish this title. The text, beautifully written by Marcus Chown, a science writer in the UK, astronomy editor for the New Scientist magazine, that was specially commissioned. And it was written for this app, about 30,000, 35,000 words of text. And the other sort of key component, of course, is the visual imagery, this fantastic manipulable imagery. And that's got two aspects to it. One is sourcing the data, and thank goodness we have to thank the American taxpayer for going out and doing the photography. And we then took advantage of that and went to a fantastic group called Planetary Visions, who are specialist midwives between NASA and the other space agencies and publishers, and they have all the expertise to take the raw NASA files, which are very difficult to publish, and turn them into something that we could then put in our computer software. And then the other component is this marvelous software that the iPad offers, and other tablets too, where you can take the text and you can take the data, and you can give the reader the ability to manipulate it in ways that are way beyond the printed page. So here we've fallen off the page of the book, gone to the planet Jupiter, sitting in an orrery, a working model of the solar system. And you can, if you don't just look at the screen but look at my hand, you can see that I'm causing this change in movement. If I touch one of the moons, it then becomes the center of attention. And I can sort of show what the universe would be like if you were on Ganymede, and you would feel just like you are on Earth with the universe rotating around you. If you're trying to explain to a child the architecture of the solar system, I suggest this is a fantastic toy to give them to play with. And then, if you want to find out more about Ganymede, you double tap and you fall back into the book. And so this was a real guiding principle, I think, in designing the information that's here. We wanted to not only have a very good author tell a story, but we also wanted to give the reader tools that allow them to explore all that stuff. And here, for every object in the solar system, Planetary Visions curated the best of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of images that exist. And because it's such a flexible medium, we could publish hundreds and hundreds of additional photographs in a gallery that hangs off each book like an appendix. So it's a very flexible medium, and one where I think both the traditional publisher and the software developer have an enormous amount to contribute. And I mentioned that with the Elements we published the book first and then the app came. Well, I think we've made a small bit of publishing history with Solar System, which I'll leave Henry to explain.
The latest build of Solar System is actually, well, it's actually still on a boat from China, but we've got a few air-freighted early copies, and we've got this is unusual publishing for Faber, a hardcover, fully illustrated print book, but it's been an absolutely fascinating publishing next development from building an app. And indeed, actually, it should be said that it's a co-edition with Black Dog and Leventhal, the publishers of the Elements book in the US. But I think one of the questions I thought about this for this talk is, and the conference is indeed called Tools of Change, what are ways that are different to, but what are ways that this kind of publishing can be familiar to traditional publishers? And I think this is one. You need to remember, it's always quite strongly in my mind that the apps we build, prevalent as they are only accessible to that still tiny minority of people with iPads. There's something about a book at the moment that's still so widely accessible and democratic that it opens up massively. And I think converting that way has been one of the two interesting publishing-related links. The second, which I'm just going to very quickly show you, is about how we approached foreign markets. Once we realized the solar system was a success, we realized that there was a strong opportunity to take it into other markets. The way we approached this wasn't according to a traditional co-edition model. There's a vital plug being pulled out. Don't worry. I can quite happily live without slides. It's a bit dominating down here anyway. But for translations, we commissioned both a German and a Japanese translator. Yeah. Well, that doesn't explain the screen going blank, unfortunately. We commissioned German and Japanese translators, and I think the thing that's interesting for me is these represent us, Faber and Touch Press, publishing directly into a foreign language territory ourselves, or with no more or less of a middleman than for publishing in English, because it's still via Apple. But the Japanese edition became App of the Week in Japan, and the sales there have been very healthy indeed. One of the blessings, actually, was that the translator into Japanese, Hiroshi Itokawa, is the nephew of Japan's greatest and most famous space explorer, and so we had press there. What I would say is this has been very successful in that case. I don't think it's completely addressed all issues relating to publicity and marketing in those territories, and that's something to look at. But what it has shown is it is absolutely perfectly possible to practically to translate. Now what I'm doing is giving evidence to prove what I'm saying, but it's perfectly possible practically to translate and reach foreign markets. And here indeed that says Solar System. And this app, Solar System for Japan, around this time, for around 2 weeks, was the highest grossing iPad app in Japan of all apps. It was the #1 position, which actually is a position it almost got, but it never quite reached in English. So this really as a follow-up and a refresher, and something actually since the last conferences we've talked at, is one of the most interesting things. And the app was built in such a way that it would be with this in mind. This was sort of part of the conception from the start. I'm now just going to hand over to Max for a final summary, before which I will then give my final bit on where we're going next.
How are we doing for time, Sophie? Do we okay? What? Yeah. All right. So if I talk for 2 minutes and then hand over to Henry, whose iPad is whose, Henry? Right. I thought I'd just finish by giving a sneak preview of one or two things that we're working on at the moment, which illustrate, I suppose, the question: what makes a good app, or what makes a good book? What makes a good interactive book? And at Touch Press, we look for three things when we select the titles that we're doing. The first is that because it's still early in the market, we want to find subjects that are international and evergreen. It's fairly obvious. The second thing, going back to the point I made earlier, is that we very much look for authorship in our work. We want a book to tell a story. We don't just want it to be a reference work, for it to be dry. And then the third thing is what I'm going to try and illustrate now, and that is that we want all our titles to go beyond the printed page, not just to take a work that makes sense in print and move it onto the digital screen. I mean, that's fine, and obviously there's a massive industry around that. But the kind of books that we at Touch Press like are ones that allow you to do this, which is to sort of bring a coffee table book alive. And here I'm putting my finger onto the little brass statue and turning it. And it's hard for those of you who haven't experienced to describe what it's like to directly manipulate these kind of images on the iPad screen. It's a very intimate experience. It's a very book-like experience. Young, really small children absolutely love it. And I would suggest that for a book like this that's talking about hundreds of interesting objects, the ability to look at them from all sides and to study them is very important. So that's one example. You've seen Fiona Shaw in The Wasteland, and something else that I think is very interesting is the ability to take large collections of objects. This is a sneak preview of a title that we've got coming out with a very distinguished author, a New York Times bestseller list, about a remarkable collection of animal skulls. And here again, you have an experience on the screen that is hard to repeat in print, or hard to equate in print. Anyway, Henry, I'll return to you.
So just to finish, I'm just going to answer. Well, no, I'm not going to answer this question, but I'm going to address it. And the question is, where next? Having had success, where do we build in it? From a Faber and a Touch Press point of view. I'm not going to say exactly where, but I can offer some clues, and the clues lie in the breadth of interest held by Touch Press, but I think also the breadth of Faber's publishing, and that's not unique to us. I think it's quite often in the digital publishing debate, it does cover all areas of interest, but it can often be quite fiction-focused, for example, and certainly our publishing, we have lists that I can firmly believe will be reinvigorated and even transformed by these digital opportunities. We have a small but celebrated list of classical music books. We've got books on pop culture. We've got books on film, drama, poetry. And what I think the opportunity we have is, instead of just, for example, getting these art forms put into words on paper, we also have the opportunity to get to the creative source. And my kind of manifesto is the chance we have to get to conductors, singers, musicians, filmmakers, screenwriters, all these people Faber knows. We've had, I think, up to now, I think we've had better contacts than we've known how to use. And I think this gives us an opportunity. So our agenda is to take this this massive interest in cultural digital activity that we've seen tapped with the Wasteland and build on it not just in literature, but into other forms of the arts and culture. And I think Faber and Touch Press have a great opportunity to do that. And I think we want to do that in a spirit of openness and partnership, partly because we have to. Faber's pool of IP on its own is not deep enough to cover all of this. We need to go to more people. And if there's a kind of a plea or a call I make, it's for openness and partnership, not defensiveness in doing this. I think people need to be open to the new business models, to the new ways of thinking, and I look forward to finding people who are up for this. And just to finish, the success that the kind of things that we've had that can be built on is this: a New York Times editorial solely devoted to the Wasteland app on a Sunday. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing that will be very hard, if not impossible, to replicate. But it shows there's one about Congress, one about the Senate, then one about the Wasteland app. But it's an extraordinary thing, and I think it's just a sign of the depth of interest. We've got this one to live up to. This is the future face of literature. We need to follow up, but it's not that so much as the fact that it's tapped in, I think, to people who are glad of something other than games or utilities on this platform, and seen it done well, and seen it commercially viably as well. And then you can see the Wasteland app here in one of Apple's ongoing education promotions. And I think that, more than anything else, suggests a long life for these apps in education, which is something we very much want to tap into. So I'll stop there. Thank you.